I was just doing my vocal warm-ups, literally. Tongue twisters. We could all do tongue twisters. I'm a theater professor, Charles. This is
Very good.
My syllabus.
You are in your element.
I am.
It's a lot.
Jen's known me for a long time. She says that with love.
I did. Of course I did. All right. Well, I think we're ready. We're set?
Yes.
Okay, let's do it.
3, 2, 1. Impact.
From the University of Texas at Austin, this is the other side of campus.
All right.
Welcome to The Other Side of Campus, the podcast that shares stories of how the University of Texas at Austin is engaged with our local, state, and national community. My name is Jen Moon. I'm a professor of instruction in the College of Natural Sciences.
And my name is Katie Dawson. I'm an associate professor of theater in the College of Fine Arts. Today, we're talking about a project that quite literally takes architecture beyond the university and city limits. Our guest is Professor Charles D. Piazza from the School of Architecture, who teaches a studio course at UT focused on sustainable community-based design in rural Texas. Professor D. Piazza's students have been working in Terra Lingua near Big Bend, a place where the landscape itself challenges us to rethink how we build, how we live, and how universities can collaborate with communities. Professor D. Piazza, welcome. It is wonderful to have you here on the other side of campus.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great to see you. So let's start with a little bit about you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background as an architect, and how you came to be interested in rural sustainable design?
Sure. So, well, first and foremost, I'm a proud graduate of UT. I did my undergraduate study here, as well as I got my Master's of Architecture in the 90s. Currently, I'm a residential architect based here. And like every architect, in a way, I've always been drawn to questions of place and material, like how architecture can grow out of the specific condition of a site. So I've spent my last 12 years since I've been back in Austin after working in many other places, mostly designing houses in and around Austin, but I've also been teaching design studio for about 12 years. So teaching in West Texas, it emerged from a desire to, in a way, reconnect architectural education to the act of making, to site, and to maybe a slower, more deliberate relationship between form, material, and landscape. Because I believe that rural projects, they tend to reveal the essential. They kind of strip away everything that's unnecessary. So this is the third studio I'm actually teaching, which is in a rural environment. I taught a studio in Hico, Texas, which is halfway between here and Fort Worth. Last year, I taught a studio in Marathon, Texas. And this semester, as you mentioned, it's interlingua.
I love the idea of literally having your class be a studio. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this specific course? It sounds like you've had 3 goes at it. Maybe you can talk about the current one, because I know, like all teachers, we revise a lot. So what are you doing in this iteration? What are the course goals? Who are the students who are in this class typically?
So this studio is it's still an experiment, even though it's a third go around. There's always kind of a formula to work with. And here, unlike the other studio, I guess the big difference, Katie, is that we were able to get funding and camp interlingua for 3-4 days and have the student immersed in the act of making, in the act of, working with the earth under the tutelage of a collaborator, which we'll talk about more later. So, but the studio is also still an experiment. I mean, it's kind of asking what happens when you take students out of the urban academic bubble and immerse them in a really remote context. And I think what appealed me to West Texas this go around is it's just a an extraordinary mix of like, it's a tough yet fragile landscape. It's got this history of self-reliance, and it has communities that face real housing and infrastructure challenges. So it's a place where architecture cannot be abstract. It has to matter, literally. So we wanted to see if a university studio could begin to, like you say, also operate like a small practice, collaborating with local partners and imagining a project that could eventually be built.
So when we talked prior to this, just as I learned about you and the work you do, you referred to this project as an experiment in reciprocity, and that really made me think. What does that phrase mean to you in the context of teaching architecture? In other words, how does reciprocity shape the way your students engage with the community?
Yeah, that's a good question. So reciprocity for me is the idea that learning and giving back can happen simultaneously. Like we go to Texas, West Texas, not as experts delivering solution, but as guests. Students and me, we are observers who can learn from how people already build. Like there is a deep knowledge of how to do things, how to adapt to that environment, and how to live in such a challenging climate. And in return, what the students bring is the energy and imagination to help envision possibilities that the community might not otherwise have the time or resource to explore. So it's less about charity and more about exchange, like a conversation between the academy and the real world.
That is such a rich idea, Charles. And I absolutely think the very best teachers for our students often can be those real world experiences. Those are the things that shift us on a cellular level. Can you think of a particular moment where something like that happened that sits with you, something where the students gained some of that local knowledge in a moment that you think was impactful?
I think for me, it was just spending 3 days in isolation where the student literally got their hands dirty and, got to build a kind of an adobe brick, or they built a little bench out of rammed earth. They operated a machine that creates compressed earth blocks. And then they built arches. So it was this they were all thrown into this very quiet, inspiring, but very intimidating environment. And they all had to pull together. Like we were eating together, we're not sleeping together, but they were sleeping in tents, communally. And that builds a very deep sense of belonging, of purpose. And it happens every time when we come back from West Texas, the studio atmosphere shifts because the students become a lot more personally connected to one another. So that was nice to witness.
Personally connected to one another, and also because it's so tangible now what they're doing and the environment that they're working. I mean, to actually, as you say, get their hands dirty and be in that space in isolation. Yeah. I imagine that's really powerful for them to also get a sense of like what kind of existing knowledge is there. Like, as you say, they're learning to build these things that are traditional objects, as I understand it, right? These benches
Yes.
and things that you had them sort of model.
Yeah, but I like the way you say existing knowledge, because that's what it's all about. They have to respond to an unfamiliar terrain, and they learn that the desert, because it's pretty much a very arid environment, it demands restraint. It's vast, it's quiet, and therefore every gesture shows. So, when we arrived, like they were really struck by the stillness, by how the light, the wind, the temperature, they become architectural forces, not just afterthought, but that's what shapes the land literally. And so the isolation really helped strip away distraction, because, you cannot just design another glass pavilion. You have to think about shade, you have to think about mass, you have to think about, water or the lack thereof. and endurance and resiliency and kind of a regenerative design. So it really pushes the student to think about architecture as something embedded, not an object placed on the land, but something formed out of it, that literally comes out of it.
Oh, that's such a powerful way of thinking about students' design thinking.
Yeah, because I think nowadays there is such a trend toward formalism, that a form, a shape will answer everything, or that it's so appealing. So here to shift the emphasis on the construction and the materiality and durability, I think it's a good lesson for everybody, students and me alike. Yeah.
I'm also really thinking a lot about, I mean, we are both artists in different sort of fields. I'm in theater, you're in architecture, but that idea of literally working with your hands and literally being in those spaces, I think really can be quite
I agree,
transformative.
Katie. It is a transformative experience. Like student, they also see the earth not just as a symbolic of sustainability, but they understand that it's a living material. It has weight, it has a color, and it has time built into it. So they began to understand structure, labor, and gravity in a very tactile way that drawings or renderings alone cannot convey. So it's a very much, a body-mind connection, which is something I think that we need as architects to get back in touch with, because it's very easy nowadays in the age of, we build with studs and it's all panelized, and it's, rarely do architects get involved in the actual constructability. I mean, we detail it, but we're not on site. So here's the opportunity to actually, shape the block. And then, we had them build little arches so that they can really, work with their body. And what's fascinating is when you start to work with a material, regardless how much you've thought about the design of what it might look like, the material shapes your thinking. I mean, eventually your design becomes informed by the intrinsic properties of the material. And I think that's important to learn, to be aware of as a student early on, that, you are shaped by the materiality. It's not an abstract, form that you are coming up with. So it's a constraint.
Yeah, so you were talking a little bit before about how having limits, having constraints is actually really helpful in creative thinking. That it's too difficult really when the you have all options open and you can do anything. It's almost paralyzing. So tell me a little bit more about that. This idea that having constraints, having, as you were talking about, the environment out there and the wind and the climate and the water and availability and things like this. How have your students responded to that challenge? Do they find it motivating, or are they frustrated? What is their response to that?
It's deeply intimidating because, when you build in a city like Austin, you can always respond to a building next door or to kind of the, whether it's 3-story, 5-story or a tree. Here, you have literally nothing. Like, you have to really think about what is the best method to propose something. And so you really have to think about temperature changes, the fact that it's a diurnal environment, it's very cold at night, very hot during the day. Insulation, how much sun can you block out, the aperture of the windows. So I think those kind of climatic constraints are very helpful. So because the first thing you have to do is think about the orientation of your building. It's usually the cheapest thing you can do as an architect, as a starting point, but it gives you the most bang for the buck. No matter how much PV panel you're going to add on your roof, if the building is not oriented the right way, you're going to have to pay extra to kind of make up, to pay for the high energy bill. So it's not easy to go back to those fundamental ideas because in a city, you don't have a choice on the orientation of the building. So here you really have to, understand the path of the sun, the direction of the wind, really think about your views, and that can be intimidating. I do believe that the best architecture comes out of a series of constraints. Usually the constraint, even if the constraint comes from the client, I think it's important to have something to rub against, because I think that's when creativity come out. If a client say, "You're my idol, do what you wish," those are the worst project, because then it's a fight with your mind, and then it's endless. It's endless. So I think constraint, and also it coming up with an architectural idea, like what is this building about? And really formulating that is a very important lesson that I'd like the students to be confronted with.
I'm hearing in all of this, talking about constraints and also talking about the sort of benefit of having a client or someone to kind of bounce or get ideas off, which makes me think a little bit about the collaboration or the collaborators you have in this project. I think Bob Estrin is someone who I've heard you mention is working with you. Could you talk a little bit about how the community partnership aspect of this project works in this course?
Yes, so I met Bob Estrin, who's a director of the School of Constructive Arts, which is based in Terlingua. He's a person who hosted us there. I met him last year when I was doing my studio in Marathon, Texas. He was helping a small shop there in Marathon, the French grocer. They decided to rebuild their grocery store using compressed earth blocks, like earth. And Bob was brought in as a consultant. So when I brought my studio there, we happened to run into him. And then he gave kind of an impromptu class to my student. And so I asked him this semester if he wanted to co-teach with me. And what is quite admirable about Bob is that he's been living in Terlingua, I think for 6-7 years, which is a time where he founded the school. And while there, he's really been interested and he's developed deep relationship with local craft people, but also he's been in a conversation with the Terlingua school district and has become aware of the challenges facing teachers because of the fact that there's not a lot of affordable housing, especially since COVID. There's been a lot of people moving to the region, and there's been a lot of Airbnb, which have really jacked up the prices. So the common interest that Bob and I had was, is there a way to provide affordable, durable housing for teachers or for any craft people or people who need it in the Big Bend area? And could the studio become kind of a testing bed for, housing settlement pattern, mostly courtyard housing? I've always, in all of my studio, I've really been interested in courtyard housing as a strategy which is ancient, regardless where you look in the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Japan, in China, there is a courtyard housing typology, which is very sympathetic to all kinds of weather. It's also kind of creates kind of an inner sanctum. And so there was a desire with Bob to maybe we can teach a studio where we entice the student to come up with a small settlement pattern made up mostly of housing, but also some more communal activities. And the hope is that at the end of the studio, we can then go to the school district and maybe show them some of those prototypes or example and see if they see the benefit in maybe doing a more design build, studio.
What an incredible experience for those students. So if I can summarize what you're saying, so you have a studio course in which students are asked to think about designing a courtyard housing project. And so what you explained to me is that means it's housing and other structures that essentially center the community. Would that be one way of saying?
Yes.
And that as an outcome of this, or as one possible outcome, that these proposals might be used to approach the school district and say, this might be an option for developing sustainable and affordable housing for your teachers. That's how impressive to be part of that class. That is just incredible.
Yes, and using local materials, which
Exactly.
are abundant in the region, so that, because transportation of goods and of material. So yeah, that's the idea. I mean, it sounds very straightforward, but it's not always evident.
What are some of those challenges? I'm kind of curious about that. So what are things that cropped up about that make it that we might not have guessed?
Well, there is a mentality that the cheaper you build, the better it is. Like there is a lot of kind of metal housing things that, where you can buy a prefabricated unit and bring it there. And that could be actually prefabrication, I think is a very interesting way for the construction industry. But I guess what people maybe don't appreciate is how this ancient technology of earthen construction has proven the test of time. And it's also very sympathetic to that environment. But we're just not used to building that way anymore. We've lost some craft, or it's time consuming, even though it's not really when you think about it. But it's not the way the construction industry has evolved, and therefore there is some built-in resistance to maybe adhere to it. So yeah, that's kind of, I would say, one thing that we hope to overcome.
Charles, to that point, it makes me think of kind of indigenous knowledges too. I mean, I think
Yes.
adobe housing has been used by cultures since the beginning of time for making a lot of housing spaces and locations that, right, keep the temperature in and work with the heat. And yeah, I really think about that. I'm going to ask you a very simplistic question. I apologize. But when you name, oh gosh, you called it the courtyard. I am thinking of Melrose Place, which was a popular show back in the 90s. I was an actor in LA, and we used to live in those kinds of apartments. We all joke that we lived in a Melrose Place style because it was basically housing like with a courtyard in the center, sometimes with a pool if you were lucky, sometimes not. But is that the sort of idea, right? That the houses are all made with the front door and you have a kind of shared courtyard space. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a variant of a courtyard housing. You can have a single family house, which is arranged around a courtyard, but it can also be a multiple dwelling. And in fact, in most studios at UT, we are fascinated as architects with the transition between a public space, which might be the street, to a semi-public, to semi-private, which could be the Melrose Place precedent. And then you go into your stoop, which is kind of a slightly more private, but opening up to this courtyard. And then you go to your private realm. And I think that transition, rather than go through a front door and you go from outside to in, stretching that, where you are kind of going through a gradual entry sequence, I think, to me, that's what a courtyard typology embraces, where it's more ceremonial, but not just ceremonial, it's more meaningful, because then it's kind of a collective housing in a way. Now, for some people, that might not be what they're looking for. They might not want to have those people, gathering outside. And I understand that, but it's kind of there is a traditional element. I really like what you said, Katie, about the fact that there are so many precedents of continuously lived-in dwellings in the United States, like Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico. There are places in Turkey, in China. In fact, we did a precedent study at the beginning of class where we asked students to look at ancient buildings that worked with earth, just so that they can develop an encyclopedia familiar or places that show that it's possible. Not just possible, but traditional, like it's happened for thousands of years. And now we are at a point where with new knowledge of hydrology, we can perfect those techniques. We can use the earth, but maybe make it more, weather resistant. And so, we can use the technology to enhance this traditional method.
That's such powerful ideas, Charles. And I'm part of the research group that does Planet Texas, and we're looking at stories of ancient resilience as one of the research strands. And a lot of folks in that area are thinking about those ideas of these indigenous ways of knowing and the ways communities for many, 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 many years have been resilient or found resilience in the ways we live and work with each other. And what you speak to really makes me think of some of that research. It's powerful, and I think an important place for us to be turning to and towards as we think about these times.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So what are you thinking about in terms of, we talked about one of the possible outcomes of this work is having some tangible product that benefits the community and of course benefits the students in the process of thinking and planning. What do you think the long-term impact will be for your students as they come away from this experience? What do you hope for them?
I think for me, especially since COVID, I think the students are striving or like hungry for this kind of on-site experience of being together in a place where, they can build something together. And I think it's a good introduction to the architecture discipline, even though when you work in an architecture firm, like I was saying earlier, it's not always the case that you get to participate in the construction process unless it's a design build studio where you can go from one to the other. So I think what I'm hoping that the student will get is maybe realize that, we talk a lot about performance of buildings and that sustainability, as we think about it today, it's not just about the performance metrics, but it's about making architecture that endures, that ages well, and that sustains the community. So it's more like a slowness. I guess I think my students will remember being there and how you adapt. There's no phone, there's no distraction, and it really affects your mind and how you think more deeply about your environment and what you're supposed to do there. So hopefully it's kind of more like the mind-body experience that Katie was talking about earlier, where it puts you in a mental space.
And that really is a powerful way to be. And I think as a parent of young people too, I think about what is it to get off our phones for a minute or social media and make something with our hands out in the real world. I think there are really powerful and, dare I say, healing centered pieces to doing that with each other.
Yeah.
With these computer programs like Minecraft and Roblox, where people build things like houses and design them and all this, what do you see? Is that something you see as like a benefit or something good that's happening amongst our kids so that they can, because my kids are obsessed with it. Like they build things all the time with Minecraft and Roblox, particularly in those programs. And I think that's what really started getting her interested in architecture, because we started saying, well, if you're interested in designing houses and thinking about, structure features and all this stuff, there's actually a discipline. What is your take on that? Are you sort of like, yeah, whatever, or is that something?
No. I think it's anything helps. Anything that makes.
Yeah, no, this is a parenting show. We didn't want to tell you.
It's okay.
But Jen and I are like full access interviewers.
Well, I was just curious.
That's
as
okay.
an architect, this is these kinds of things. Kids are. Minecraft is really popular, and so does Roblox. And I'm just kind of curious.
I think anytime they're thinking about design or putting things together, I think it's helpful. It's like my analogy is I was reading an article a long time ago about I think the guy who owned Ely, which is a very high-end coffee And he was asked, don't you feel threatened by the advent of Starbucks, because they take competition away from you? And his response was brilliant. He would say, well, actually, I want their taste buds to become more and more sophisticated so that they will gravitate to my product. So I would say, eventually, if there is a desire to put things together and they want to know more, they might come to an architect. Hopefully, or they'll go to AI. I don't know. Hard to know. I want to feel that there will be a desire that there will always be a need, a human need, when you design your house to solicit the services of a human or of an architect or someone who helps you, make
the relational piece. And I appreciated that. I think that is part of what I sit with in the story of your work in this studio too, Charles, is I think, and again, I do a lot of experiential learning because I'm in the arts and that's what we do. And I love the idea of constraints. I'm teaching a museum theater course right now, and I love it because it's so hard. Yeah. Like you have to get everything approved, and working in the studios, like a gallery space, is really hard. Yeah. And that is so much easier to actually get the project done because the constraints mean you have to make a decision that works in this. Otherwise, they would never finish the project in a semester. They never would, right? Exactly. So the constraints are a blessing. And I think there's just something wonderful about surmounting a challenge with a group of people and having to figure stuff out. Those are the skills that every student needs leaving a university education, whether they stay in the field they're studying at the moment or not. I think those skills are huge.
I would say the only challenge is that, if we wanted students to build housing interlingua, it's going to take a long time. It doesn't work with our semester by semester calendar, unless it's a 2 semester. So I think there's inherent challenges about having the student be involved in the design and the fabrication. Yeah. But who knows? Yeah. That's kind of it takes time. Yeah, it takes time.
Do students ever do independent projects where they're able to span several semesters on a single project, or?
I've heard it being done. We had a teacher who's no longer teaching, who taught actually a design build studio. And I think he had 2 semesters. The first semester was about the history and theory, and then the design. And then the second semester, they would go on site. It was mostly along the Gulf of Mexico. And they would build like a pavilion of some sort. And I think, students are, thriving for that kind of hands-on experience. Okay.
Time. I know. We just want to sit and talk all day. That's the challenge of a delightful guest. But I know folks have a heart out. So, Charles, thank you. It's been just such a pleasure to get to know you, and hopefully we'll see you around campus.
Absolutely. There's this famous Winston Churchill quote, which is, "We shape our building, thereafter our building shape us." And I think that's definitely, the power of architecture.
Yeah, I was going to say, right? Depends on the building, right?
It depends on the building. Exactly. Well, but thank you very much, Katie. Thank you very much, Jen, for the opportunity to share my studio experience with you both. And I really appreciate the small chat and the discussion.
Oh, such a pleasure. End scene. Okay.
End scene.
You've been listening to the other side of campus.
All right. Isn't he great? He's so great.
Such a delight. Yeah. We knew that was going to be good, Jen. And I think
so much of what he said, I was thinking of you. I'm like, oh, Katie's super excited about this. I could see your eyes just light up. Oh, so.
Oh yeah.
So neat.
Oh yeah.
And I love that the student experience is really centered in all of this.
I think we need all these different types of learning experiences, right?
Well, right. I'm not going to teach my genetics class in West Texas, but